This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. I guess welcome to a podcast in the midst of the corona crisis. And this is going to be a difficult time to know exactly how to respond to what is happening. Normally in a situation of this kind, we will be out on the streets demonstrating and agitating and all the rest of it, but we're in this kind of necessary condition of personal isolation at a moment when really you would want to think about collective forms of action. But this is, as Marx would put it, not a circumstance of our own choosing. So we have to figure out how best to make use of it. So I was thinking, actually, rather than dwelling upon the particularities of the situation here in New York and elsewhere, that one might offer some reflections on possible alternatives. And since this is about anti-capitalism, how does an anti-capitalist think about circumstances of this kind? And on this, I was very much struck by a commentary that Marx makes in his comments on the Civil War in France, and in particular on what happened in the Paris Commune, which was the big uprising of 1871. And Marx writes the following. He says, the working class did not expect miracles from the Commune. They have no ready-made utopias to introduce by decree of the people. They know that in order to work out their own emancipation, and along with it that higher form to which present society is irresistibly trending by its own economical agencies, they will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historic processes, transforming circumstances and men. They have no ideals to realize, but to set free the elements of the new society with which old collapsing bourgeois society itself is pregnant. Now, I want to make some comments on this passage. First, of course, Marx was antagonistic somewhat to the thinking of the socialist utopians, of which there were many in the 1840s, 1850s in France, tradition of Fourier, Saint-Simon, Cabet, Proudhon to some degree, and so on. Marx always felt that the utopian socialists were dreamers and that they were not practical workers who were going to actually transform the conditions of labor in the here and now, and that in order to transform conditions here and now, you needed a good grasp on exactly what the nature of capitalist society is about. But he's very clear that the project is, of course, the emancipation of the worker. And the self-emancipation of the laborers was very much on Marx's mind at the time of the Paris Commune. And he adds to this the idea that capital itself is actually creating the possibilities for a transformation. And that through these long struggles, which Marx is talking about, it will be possible to set free, as he says, the elements of the new society, that is the emancipated society for the workers, the elements of this new society with which old collapsing bourgeois society itself is pregnant. Now, let's agree that we're living in a situation of old collapsing bourgeois society. And I have to say, if I look at it, I think that it's pregnant with all kinds of ugly things that I don't particularly want to set free. But Marx is not saying set free everything inside of that old collapsing bourgeois society. What he's saying is that we need to select those aspects of the collapsing bourgeois society which will contribute to the emancipation of the worker and the emancipation of the laborer. And then this comes to the question of, okay, well, what are those possibilities and where are those possibilities coming from? Now, Marx does not explain that in this particular passage, but much of his work is dedicated to revealing exactly or dwelling exactly upon that problem. And one of the places in which he does this at great length is in this very large text which he wrote in 1858 on the Grundrisse. And some passages in the Grundrisse, I think, shed light on exactly what it is that Marx has in mind with this idea of setting free something which is going on inside of bourgeois society. And in the Grundrisse, one of the things that Marx dwells upon is the whole kind of question of technological change and technological dynamism. And what he shows is that capitalist society, by definition, is going to be heavily invested in the innovation and heavily invested in the construction of new technological and organizational possibilities. And that is so because as an individual capitalist, if I'm in competition with other capitalists, I will get an excess profit if my technology is superior to my rivals. So every individual capitalist has an incentive to search out a more productive technology than those with which that capitalist is in competition with. So the technological dynamism then, therefore, is embedded within the nature of a capitalist society. And Marx recognizes this, very early on from the Communist Manifesto onwards, that this is going to be one of the revolutionary aspects of a capitalist society, that it is going to be technologically revolutionary, and that therefore it will never be content with its existing technology. It will be constantly seeking to improve it because of these competitive forces. And these competitive forces are such as to reward the person who has the more advanced technology and to reward the society that has the more advanced technology. So if we break this down to a whole kind of competition between, say, different countries or different social formations, then the one with the most sophisticated and dynamic technology is the one that is going to lead the pack. So technological dynamism is built into capitalist society. But then Marx kind of makes a kind of interesting kind of point that when we first think about technologies, we imagine that somebody's there making something or other and they seek a technological improvement in what it is that they're making. That is, the technological dynamism is specific to a particular factory, a particular production system, a particular situation. But it turns out that many technologies actually spill over from one sphere of production to another. They actually become generic in the sense that, for instance, computer technology is available to anybody who wants to use it for whatever purposes. Automating technologies are available to all kinds of people. So at that point, Marx kind of says, well, it is hardly surprising to find that even by the time you get to the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s in Britain, that the invention of new technologies becomes a business. That is, it's no longer somebody who's making textiles or something like that who is interested in the new technology. Somebody just makes a new technology and then seeks to apply it all over the place. The initial example of that was, of course, the steam engine. Steam engine had all of these applications from mining and drainage of water out of the mines. It had it in terms of making steam engines and railroads and harnessing the new technologies to the power looms and all that kind of thing. So if you were sort of somebody who wanted to go into business, machine technologies and new technologies and new products and all the rest of it became actually a business in its own right. So what Marx talks about in the Grundrisse is what happens when technology becomes a business. So that it's no longer a necessity which is being met by technological innovation. Technological innovation goes out and actually creates the market rather than the market pushing for the new technology. And the new technologies, therefore, become cutting edge of the dynamism of a capitalist society with all these kinds of consequences. So the first step then is to say, well, technologies are never static. They're never they're constantly evolving, but also there are whole sectors of society which are given over to actually creating new innovations for the sake of new innovations. And that whoever can create the innovation which is going to capture the imagination or have the most applications is going to do extremely well. So this idea then that technology itself becomes a business becomes absolutely central to the nature of what a capitalist society is about. And this is what, in some ways, differentiates capitalism from all other modes of production. That, of course, there were technological changes in ancient China and earlier on, and even in feudalism, there were technological changes. But the way in which technology becomes a business and becomes a generic kind of business, and that is something which is very specific to capitalism, and therefore starts to become the driver of what is going on in a capitalist society. So Marx talks about this in the Grundrisse, and then points out something very, very significant, which is that in order for this technology to become a business, you need to mobilize new knowledges in certain kinds of ways. And so what Marx then does is to say, okay, technology becoming a business is not independent of the application of science and technology. And actually the creation of new technologies becomes integrated with the rise of science and technology as an intellectual and academic discipline. And therefore, what we're doing with the new technologies is we're seeing the application of science and technology and new knowledges and the creation of new knowledges which become necessary to this technological evolution. So here you've got another kind of aspect of the nature of a capitalist mode of production, which is dynamic in terms of its technology, but that technological dynamism is connected to a dynamism in science and technology, so that science and technology and the mobilization of new knowledges come into the picture very, very strongly. So Marx then kind of says, well, okay, if that is the situation, then what does this actually do to the production processes and the way in which labor is relating to the production processes? Because in the pre-capitalist era, let's say the 15th, 16th centuries, the laborer certainly had control over means of production and tools and became very skilled in the utilization of these tools. And to that degree, the laborer became a monopolist of a certain kind of knowledge and certain kind of understanding. But Marx then points out that by the time you get to the factory system and by the time you get to contemporary world, that is no longer the case. That the laborer's skills are in a way left to one side because technology and science take over. And technology and science and the production of that new knowledge then becomes incorporated in the machine. And so Marx, in an astonishing set of passages in the Grundrisse, which, by the way, it is very interesting for you to go off and read them, and it's around page 650 to 710, just to give you the reference. In those astonishing passages, Marx talks about the way in which new technologies and knowledge become embedded in the machine, and they're no longer in the laborer's brain, and the laborer is put to one side, and the laborer simply becomes a machine minder. Whereas all of the intelligence and all of the knowledge and so on, which used to belong to the laborer, and the laborer could use that as a certain monopoly power vis-a-vis capital, because the capitalist needed the skills of the laborer, that skill actually gets embodied in the machine, and it's the machine where the knowledge resides, and therefore the production of knowledge flows into the machine, and the machine therefore becomes very much part of this capitalist dynamism. So this is the situation that Marx is describing. And what this means is that the dynamism of a capitalist society and what is going on in a capitalist society is going to be very much dependent upon these sorts of innovations. And right now, of course, we're in a situation in which that issue is becoming crucial. I mean, it's interesting that Marx is writing about it as being critical and crucial to capital back in 1858. Well, right now, when you think about the question of artificial intelligence, to what degree is artificial intelligence being developed through science and technology, and to what degree is it being applied, likely to be applied in production processes in such a way as to, in a way, displace the labourer, and in fact disarm the labourer in terms of the labourer's capacities for imagination, skill, and all the rest of it. And what this leads to then is to Marx to make the following kind of commentary in the Grundrisse. Let me read it to you, because I think it's really, really fascinating. And it is simply this, that you say these technological transformations, that there is a metabolic shift, he says, between to create a situation in which all powers of labor are transposed into powers of capital. The productive power of labor moves into fixed capital, something which is external to labor, and that the laborer therefore is pushed to one side. So fixed capital becomes the means by which intelligence from science and technology enters into the production process. And then at the bottom here, Marx says something very important, which is going to shed light on what it is in a capitalist society that the collapsing bourgeois order is pregnant with. And it's this, that capital, quite unintentionally, reduces human labor, expenditure of energy, to a minimum. This, he says, will redound to the benefit of emancipated labor and is the condition of its emancipation. In other words, Marx is looking at something as about like automation or artificial intelligence or whatever it is, as something which is a condition for the emancipation of labor. And since, in that passage we had from Paris Commune, it's the emancipation of labor that's involved. That condition is something which needs to be embraced. And the possibilities of that are taken up a little bit later, because what this leads to is a situation of the following. It leads, he says, and I'll read you again from the Grundrisse, to the free development of individualities. And by the way, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Marx is always emphasizing that it's the free development of the individual, which is going to be the end point of what collective action is going to push for. And this idea that Marx is all about collective action and the suppression of individualism is wrong. Actually, it's the other way around. Marx is about collective action in order to gain an individual benefit. And we'll come back to that idea in a moment. But it's the free development of individualities. That is crucial here. And he says this, that this is going to be registered through the general reduction of the necessary labor, that is the labor which is needed to reproduce daily life of society, that is going to be reduced to a minimum. That the basic needs of society can be taken care of very easily, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific development of the individuals in the time set free and with the means created for all of them. That is, setting free individuals to do what they want is critical because you can take care of the necessities by the sophisticated technology. And he says the problem here is that capital itself is the moving contradiction, in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labour time on the other side as a sole measure and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labour time in the necessary form, that is what is really necessary, to increase it in the superfluous form. Now, the superfluous form is what Marx calls surplus value. That is the surplus, and who's going to capture the surplus? And the problem, obviously, that Marx is going to identify is that the surplus is available and it's created, but it is not available to labour. It is not actually being applied to the emancipation of the labourer. It's being actually applied to the feathering of the nests of the bourgeoisie, and therefore the accumulation of wealth within the bourgeoisie. So here's the contradiction, he says. Truly, he says, the wealth of a nation, how would we understand that? Well, he says, you can understand it in terms of the mass of money and all the rest of it that somebody commands. But he says this: a truly wealthy nation is one in which the working day is 6 rather than 12 hours. Wealth is not command over surplus labour time, but rather disposable time outside that needed in direct production for every individual and the whole society. That is, wealth of a society is going to be measured by how much disposable time we all have to do what the hell we like without any constraints, because our basic needs are met. And Marx's argument is you have to have a collective getting together to make sure that that kind of society is constructed. But what gets in the way is, of course, the fact that the class relation and the dominance of the class relation. Now, there's an interesting kind of feature of this in relationship to our own situation. Here we are in a situation where individually we're actually being turned into with a lot of disposable time. I mean, most of us are stuck at home. We can't go to work. We can't do things. What are we going to do? In other words, we've created this situation in which we have a vast amount of disposable time. And the interesting thing is, a lot of us really have a hard time figuring out what to do with it. The second thing is that, of course, we've had this mass unemployment. The last data today suggests in the United States that something like 16 million people have lost their jobs. Now, normally one would say this is a catastrophe, and of course it is a catastrophe, because when you lose your job, you lose the capacity to reproduce your own labour power by going into the supermarket because you have no money. And most people in the United States, I don't know what proportion it is, there's some data suggesting that you know, I don't know, 40 or 50% of the families in the United States have no more than $400 of surplus of which to carry themselves over in a crisis. They are likely to be hitting the streets very soon with starvation close by, because a lot of people of that sort have lost their jobs. But look at the situation. The situation is that we need a collective form of action. Okay, distancing, behaviors, all of those kinds of things, a collective form of action to get us out of this real serious crisis of how to deal with this virus. It's a collective form of action which is required to free us up as individuals to do what we like. We cannot do what we like right now. Now, this is a good metaphor for the nature of what capital is about. Capital is about creating a society where most of us are not free to do what we want, because we are actually taken up with producing wealth for the capitalist class. And what Marx is kind of saying is, well, maybe those 16 million unemployed people, if they could actually find something, you know, some way of getting enough money to support themselves and go in and buy the commodities they need to survive, then there would be mass emancipation. In other words, do we want to come out of this crisis by simply saying, okay, put all of those 16 million people back to work in some of those pretty awful jobs that they may have been involved in before? Is that how we want to come out of it? Or would we want to say, okay, let's sit back and say, is there some way to organize the production of basic goods and services so that everybody has something to eat and everybody has a decent place to live? And we put a moratorium on any kind of evictions and everybody can live rent-free. And, in other words, isn't this the moment where we could actually seriously think about the creation of an alternative society? And instead of saying we all want to go back to work and get those jobs back and restore everything to what it was before this crisis started, maybe we should say, oh, why don't we come out of this crisis creating an entirely different kind of social order? That is, why don't we take that which current collapsing bourgeois society is pregnant with and liberate these aspects of artificial intelligence and technological change and organizational forms, so that we actually create something radically different from that which we existed before. And this, I think, is kind of one of the ways in which we might want to really think through what an alternative might look like. In other words, this is a moment in which the possibility of this alternative actually exists there. And instead of just doing knee-jerk reaction and saying, oh, we've got to get those 16 million jobs back immediately. No, maybe we should do and expand one of the things that is going on already, which is that collective forms of, say, provision of food and meals. I mean, in New York City right now, several of the restaurant systems have remained open, and through donations, they're actually providing free meals to the mass of the population that is in that situation. It's lost its jobs, it can't move, it can't get around. In other words, instead of kind of saying, well, okay, this is what we do in an emergency, why don't we say, okay, this is the moment when we can start to say to all of those restaurants, okay, your mission is to feed the population so that everybody has a decent meal and at least once a day, twice a day. And we have elements of that society already here, which is that, for instance, a lot of schools provide school meals and so on. And so keeping that going. So, okay, isn't this a moment where we could use this socialist imagination to construct an alternative society? This is not utopian. This is saying, all right, all those restaurants on the Upper West Side which have closed and which are sitting there kind of, well, okay, we get the people back in, they start producing the food, and they actually feed the population on the streets, and they feed it in the houses, and they give it to the old people. And we need that collective action in order for all of us to become individually free. And this is the point that Marx is making again and again and again, that the route to real individualism, as opposed to the fake one, which is constantly preached in kind of bourgeois ideology, the real route to individual liberty and freedom and emancipation is a situation where all of our needs are taken care of through collective action in such a way as to mean that we only work 6 hours a day and the rest of the time we do exactly as we please. In other words, isn't this an interesting moment to really think about the dynamism and the possibilities of construction of an alternative socialist society? With that thought, let me stop here and I'll continue with this argument in the next podcast.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.